For many outside of the region, the Middle East is seen as a total mess. This is mainly due to the last century of imperialism and foreign intervention inside the region, along with the ethnic and religious divisions that still continue to haunt the region to this day. However, for a while, there was one man who had a dream to unite the Middle East and make it a paradise for Arabs everywhere. And that man's name was Gamal Nasser. For some of you, you may be asking, who was Nasser and why did he fail? Well folks, that's what we're here to find out. Gamal Abdel Nasser Hussein was born on January 15, 1918 in Alexandria, Egypt. Nasser's father was a post worker and had to move around a lot. As a kid, he would mainly accompany his father's travels. One of the things young Gamal loved to do was write letters to his mother and tell her how much he loved her and missed her. Aww. However, in 1926, Nasser would receive news that his mother died giving birth to one of his younger brothers. This would be something Nasser would never recover from, and he was deeply hurt when his father remarried not long after his mother's death. He would then go on to live with his paternal grandparents and then later his uncle in Cairo, who happened to be anti-British. You see, for the longest time, Egypt was a colony of the British Empire. And while the country technically got its independence in 1922, the British would still have influence in Egypt for the next couple of decades. Nasser's uncle's anti-British views will have a great impact on him later on into his life. In school, Nasser wasn't the best student, always getting into trouble with his teachers, especially those who were British. Despite that, he was very popular among his peers. He would star in school plays and would even write articles for the school's newspaper. But one of the things that attracted Nasser the most was political activism. Nasser was part of a group known as the Young Egypt Party who wanted to kick the British out of Egypt. In 1935, Nasser would lead a student protest against the British, and it went pretty well. I'm kidding. Two of the protesters were killed and Nasser got a bullet grazed through his head, and it was a miracle that he managed to survive in the first place. Because of this, Nasser decided that politics wasn't for him and he went back to being a student. In 1937, Nasser would apply for the Royal Military Academy, but was denied due to his anti-British views and being associated with the protesters. He then decided to go to law school, but he didn't like it, dropped out, and reapplied to the military academy, with them accepting him this time. Mainly because he knew someone on the board. After graduating from the academy, Nasser would be stationed in Sudan for the next couple of years before being brought back to Egypt in 1943 as an instructor for the military academy. During this time period, Nasser would develop more pro-nationalist sentiments as he saw the British remove Egyptian Prime Minister Hussein Seri Pasha for his pro-Nazi sympathies and saw the King of Egypt, King Pharaoh, as a British puppet. See, not many people liked the king. He wasn't an Arab like most of his subjects, being a leftover of the old Ottoman Turkish Empire. In fact, Arabic wasn't even his first language, it was his third, with the first two being Turkish and French. He would be very disconnected from his people as under his rule, wealth inequality skyrocketed in Egypt. And as I mentioned earlier, he was seen as a puppet for the Western powers, specifically the British. This angered Nasser, and he and a group of army officers planned to one day overthrow the king. However, that day will not come for another couple years. In 1948, Nasser's skills as a military commander would be tested. After World War II, millions of Jewish refugees from Europe were heading to British-controlled Palestine. The Palestinians saw this as a threat and wanted their own territory, along with the extermination of all the Jews in the region. Because of this, the United Nations voted upon to give each people their own territory. In the end, one territory would go to the Jews and the other would go to the Palestinians. While not perfect, the Jews were happy with what they got. The Arabs, not so much. So on May 15, 1948, literally a day after Israel's independence, the Arab countries of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan attacked Israel. Nasser was commander of the 6th Infantry Battalion, where he would be surrounded by Israeli forces. His requests for reinforcements were denied and vowed that he and his men would fight to the bitter end. However, he was saved when the war ended in 1949 and the Egyptians were allowed to fall back. Despite that, Nasser had respect for his enemies and would help bury the bodies of 67 Israeli soldiers and would attend their funerals for them, with his men sending out attention. He was then sent to Israel with an Egyptian delegation to accept the terms of surrender, as Israel did win the war. Nasser found these terms to be humiliating, as Israel would gain a huge amount of territory. Despite the aforementioned respect for the Israeli soldiers, Nasser's bitterness towards Israel would not go away during the rest of his life. After the war, Nasser would return to his position as instructor for the Royal Military Academy. It is here where he tried to branch out and make more alliances with different groups. One of these groups would be the Muslim Brotherhood. However, Nasser would break ties mainly due to their differences in ideology, which we'll get to in a moment. In 1949, Egypt's ally Syria went through a coup where the Syrian military overthrew the government. Nasser saw this as a sign for an opportunity that needed to be taken. So he established the Free Officer Movement, where disgruntled Egyptian army officers joined together and planned to overthrow the Egyptian monarchy. After 3 years of planning, they would finally get their chance. In January 1952, there would be a confrontation between British army officials and Egyptian police officers in the city of Ismailia. This confrontation led to 40 police officers being killed. As you can imagine, this enraged many Egyptians, in which led to riots and protests across the country. Seeing the turmoil of Egypt and the unpopularity of the current government, Nasser saw his chance to strike. On July 23, 1952, Nasser and the Free Officers would overthrow the government. King Pharaoh would be forced to flee to Italy, where he would stay there for the rest of his life. A year later, the Republic of Egypt would be established. At first, Nasser didn't really want to rule, as he thought the Egyptian people would not accept him, so the first president of the new republic was a man by the name of Mohammed Naguim, who was a well-respected army general and one of Nasser's closest allies. However, the two men would have a falling out, and Nasser thought it would be best to get rid of Naguim. So Naguim was ousted and would be put under house arrest until Nasser's death in the early 1970s. It was then that Gamal Abdel Nasser would become the president of Egypt. One of his first actions as president was to kick the British out of Egypt, finally securing the country's independence. Later, in October 1954, Nasser would face an assassination attempt on his life by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. You see, Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood hated each other. This was because Nasser was more of a secularist who believed in the separation of religion and government, while the Brotherhood believed that Egypt should be run under traditional Islamic law. Because of this, they tried to kill him. However, the assassination attempt failed, and Nasser would give a rather rousing speech stating, "My countrymen, my blood spills for you and for Egypt. I will live for your sake and die for the sake of your freedom and honor. Let them kill me. It does not concern me as long as I have instilled pride, honor, and freedom in you. If Gamal Abdel Nasser should die, each of you shall be Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser is of you, and from you he is willing to sacrifice his life for the nation!"
That was beautiful.
Not only did the assassination attempt fail, but it only made him more popular, thus Nasser used this as an excuse to expand his power. So Nasser would eliminate his opponents, ban all political parties in Egypt except his own, persecuted Egypt's Jewish and Christian minorities to the point where many had to flee or were deported, and forced out many Europeans in high economic and political positions, thus putting an iron grip onto the country. However, despite all that, Nasser would help to modernize Egypt, such as building dams that would give water and electricity to villages and towns that never had them, expanding women's rights in a rather traditionally Muslim country. Nasser would also enact land reforms, taking the land that once belonged to the British and gave them to Egyptian farmers, which actually worked out surprisingly well, as Egypt's economy managed to grow 3 times, thus increasing the Egyptian middle class. In 1956, Nasser would nationalize the Suez Canal. For those who don't know how important that is, the Suez Canal was basically the port that made it faster to transport goods between Asia, Europe, and East Africa at the time. It was mainly under the control of the British and the French, but now that the Europeans are out, the Egyptians took control. While many Egyptians were happy about this, some of the European powers were not. Not only did this enrage the British and the French, but the Israelis as well, as they saw it as a threat to their borders. So in October 1956, the 3 countries would invade Egypt. The Allies managed to beat back the Egyptian army and gain some ground. However, it took the United States and Russia to stop the war, and it kind of went something like this.
Quit f***ing around! You! Get the hell out of here! Your passion, it moves me so. Therefore, I shall concede this day and make my leave. Get bent, ass-clown!
Despite almost losing and being bailed out by the 2 superpowers, Nasser was seen as a hero not only to the Egyptians, but to the rest of the Arab and African world, as he was viewed as the man who stood up to the Western Imperial powers and won. As the failure of the Suez Crisis led to the resignations of both British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and French Prime Minister Guy Mollet respectively. Because of this, Nasser would start a new movement called Arab nationalism. Now, Arab nationalism has been around since the rule of the Ottoman Empire since the 19th century, but it was Nasser who truly brought it to the mainstream, in which he believed that the countries of the Middle East and Africa should be all united under his rule. His persona would give pride to the Arabs of the region, and it seemed like his dreams of a united Middle East was bound to happen. In 1958, Egypt would unite with Syria to form the United Arab Republic. This frightened the kings and sultans of many of the surrounding Arab nations who were afraid that Nasser's influence would spread to their countries. And their fear was justified, as it was Nasser who came into power by overthrowing the monarchy of his nation. In the search for allies, Nasser went to the Soviet Union as he did not trust the United States, mainly due to their close ties with Great Britain and Israel. But despite having close ties with the Soviet Union, Nasser would be a prominent player in the non-aligned movement, countries that wanted nothing to do with the Cold War. He even expanded his philosophy to Pan-Africanism, as he wanted to promote good relationships with the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And he even tried to reach out to the rest of the Muslim world. At the end of the 1950s, it seemed like Nasser was on top of the world and his dream of a pan-Arab state was close. However, the 1960s would be his downfall. In 1961, Syria broke away from the United Arab Republic as there were cultural and political differences between the two nations. Not to mention, the Syrians felt like they were being mistreated by the Egyptians. In 1962, Nasser would send Egyptian troops to help overthrow the kingdom of North Yemen. Unfortunately, this led to a civil war and it turned out to be a disaster for Egypt, to the point where it's earned the nickname Egypt's Vietnam. Another black stain was the relocation of Egypt's Nubian population. You see, at the time, Nasser was building the Answar Dam, which was the largest at the time. However, 50,000 Nubians were forced out of their homes and moved to different places in order to build a dam, which many of their homes were destroyed. To this day, many Nubians want the return of their ancestral homeland, and the Egyptian government only recently started to pay reparations. But there was one conflict that would show that Nasser's time was over. In June 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack on its Arab neighbors of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Arabs were caught off guard with most of their equipment being destroyed and soldiers in disarray. It was so bad that the war only lasted 1 week. As a result, Israel gained so much territory, taking the Sinai Peninsula that was originally part of Egypt. For Nasser, this was a humiliating defeat. As a spokesperson for Pan-Arab nationalism, to be beaten by Israel was the final straw and the realization that his dream was dead. Later that same year, Nasser would resign, however he would later find out that he was still popular among the Egyptian public, despite all that would happen. So Nasser returned to the presidency, and the first thing he would do is make reforms and weed out corruption in his government, which is just another way of saying he wanted to take out anyone he considered to be a threat to him. He would get rid of the military officers who let Israel win the Six-Day War. One of these officers was Abdel Hakim Amer. He was head of the Egyptian military and actually one of Nasser's first allies, going back as far as the academy days. However, due to his failure and being accused of trying to overthrow Nasser, he was executed. Later, he would pull out his troops from North Yemen and would spend the next few years fighting a border war with Israel, trying to regain the territory that was lost, with little to no success. On September 27, 1970, Nasser will call an emergency meeting among the Arab states to discuss how they can all unite to defeat Israel, as the Jordanians and Palestinians were fighting among each other. However, after the meeting, Nasser was suffered from a heart attack. Several hours later, he was confirmed to be dead. Gamal Abdel Nasser was gone. Millions of Arabs, Africans, and Muslims from around the world would attend his funeral to honor the man who they deemed to be their leader. Now, normally this is where I would end the video, but we need to give a brief mention to his successor, Anwar Sadat. Sadat was actually one of Nasser's oldest colleagues, with them meeting in the Royal Military Academy during their youth. However, he was able to escape the purges. Unlike Nasser, not many people had faith in Sadat, and their doubts will be proven right as he reversed a lot of Nasser's policies, cut ties with the Soviet Union, started a war with Israel that ended in stalemate, and in an ironic twist of fate, actually signed a peace treaty with Israel, making Egypt the first Arab country to recognize the Jewish state, in which in return the Israelis gave back the Sinai Peninsula. As you can imagine, this did not go well with many Arabs and Muslims, claiming it as a betrayal to Nasser's ideology, which led to Sadat's assassination in 1981. So that was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a man filled with so much pride that he wanted to unite all of the Middle East. Nasser was a charismatic leader who managed to modernize Egypt and put a big middle finger to the Western Imperial powers. However, he was also a tyrant who put Egypt under a military dictatorship that still exists today. His influence has spread throughout the region and outside of it as well. Revolutionaries like Fidel Castro of Cuba and even the young Nelson Mandela of South Africa before he became all peaceful, stating Nasser was their inspiration. And many tried to replicate his success, such as Muammar Gaddafi of Libya and Saddam Hussein of Iraq, but all failed one way or another. But one wonders, what if he succeeded? Would he manage to keep things steady, or would we still see the same problems today? But all I can say is that he truly was the modern day Pharaoh.